Well, one of you shared with me a joke earlier this week that I thought fit into the theme of the sermon this morning. There was an older man who had serious hearing problems for many years. He went to the doctor, and the doctor was able to have him fitted for a set of hearing aids that allowed the man to hear 100% again. The old man went back in a month to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Your hearing is perfect. Your family must be really pleased that you can finally hear them again." The man replied, "Oh, I haven't told my family yet. I just sit around and listen to their conversations. As a result, I've changed my will 3 times now." Hearing makes all the difference, doesn't it? Especially when you're actually listening. After all, there is a difference, isn't there? Or at least that's certainly the case in my household. My children always hear my voice. I can promise you they are seldom ever listening. Of course, Marion has a name for it, and apparently I've been diagnosed too. I suspect you've heard of it before. It's more commonly referred to as selective hearing. I suppose we all have it to some degree, especially in the church. I mean, you'd never sneak a peek at the cell phone to catch the score during worship, would you? Or happen to nod off for a moment during the sermon? I had a congregant one time who simply owned it, although I'm not sure he was being completely honest. He said to me, "Now I want you to know that you might see my eyes closed during your sermon on occasion, but I promise I'm not sleeping. I'm just meditating on your words." Don't get me wrong, there's no judgment here. I must confess that I've meditated on those words a few times when I was in your seat, which is the reason I'm glad that long ago the church did away with what's called the tithing man. Perhaps you've heard of him before. Apparently during the 1700s, many churches employed a position to ensure that order was maintained during the Sunday morning service. And so they called the position the tithing man. He'd sit at a table in the front of the sanctuary, normally right in the front of the pulpit, and keep an eye on the congregation to make sure that everyone was behaving. Specifically, it was the tithing man's job to make sure that everyone stayed awake during the sermon. But to help him carry out that task, he was always equipped with this rather long pole that had a big hard knob on the end of it. And if the tithing man saw a boy or a man nod off for a moment, he'd take that pole, walk down the aisle, and poke the person in the head with it, sometimes apparently leaving bruising so hard. Now don't worry, women got off a little bit easier. For them, the tithing man used the other end of his pole, which actually had a rabbit's foot or a foxtail on it, and he'd wave it in their face to tickle them awake. Which reminds me, I did forget one thing during the announcements this morning. There's a sign-up sheet in the center if anybody would like to take on this position here in the coming weeks. You see, the truth is, it's just a lot easier to hear than to listen. Listening requires a kind of intentionality. It takes some work, which is the reason not everyone is a good listener. In fact, most of the time we refer to listening as a gift. I can't help but wonder if that's the reason we're putting devices in our homes that will listen to us when no one else is willing or able. Although I worry these listening devices are listening to us more than we'd prefer them to. That was the case for Bethany Becknell recently. When she stayed home from church with a sick child one Sunday morning, she live streamed the worship service from her church. The pastor was speaking about how depersonalized our lives have become and said one doesn't even need to go to a store to shop anymore. Instead, one can simply say, "Alexa, buy toilet paper." Immediately, Bethany heard a voice from her bedroom, her Amazon Echo speaker saying, "Okay, I've added it to your shopping cart." I literally was reading this sermon to Marion last night, and the same thing happened in our kitchen last night. Well, Jesus certainly seems to think there's a difference between hearing and listening in our reading this morning. Jesus is walking through the temple when a group of folks gather around him and ask, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, just tell us plainly." And Jesus answers, "I have told you, but you don't believe." He goes on to say, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Now, while the translation we read this morning uses the word hear, other translations of the Greek in this passage actually are listen. Because Jesus isn't interested in sheep merely recognizing his voice. No, the sheep that follow the Good Shepherd, they understand that voice. After all, he says they follow that voice. And that's the real difference between hearing and listening, isn't it? Hearing is a kind of idle practice, while listening, on the other hand, requires a sort of response. Perhaps it's following to Jesus' point or deciding not to follow just the same. It might mean that you change your mind, or it might mean that you remain even more unchanged. The point is, while hearing is mere stimulus, listening requires us to decide. It challenges us to respond, even if that response is to dig in our heels and remain the same. Which I think is ultimately what makes hearing easier than listening, right? It's easier to hear the same narratives that reinforce our beliefs than to listen to alternative ones that might challenge them. It's easier to hear the voices of others while waiting for our turn to speak than to sincerely listen to those who are already speaking without any concern for what we might say. It's easier to hear the same stories over and over again from those with whom we are comfortable than to listen to new stories from those who might make us uncomfortable. I was at a fundraiser this last week for Must Ministries, during which a former client of Must shared with the group her story. It was a hard story to listen to. It included things like job loss and homelessness and, hopelessness. I suspect that's the reason that as I looked around the room, more than half those present were looking on their phones, checking their emails, and scrolling Facebook rather than listening to her story. Which must be the reason most aren't listening to Jesus either. Not just in this passage, but throughout his ministry. I mean, understandably so. He says things you have to die in order to live. And when you do it for the least of these, you do it for me. And you should love your neighbor as yourself, which, by the way, includes your enemies. I'm not sure if there's a perfect litmus test for whether or not you're hearing God's voice. But if it's always easy to listen to, I'm not sure it's of the divine. One of you shared with me a story this week about a great preacher who, upon his retirement, was asked by the congregation's president about the secret to his sermons. The pastor said, well, there are really two halves to each sermon. Actually, there are really two sermons. There's my sermon, and then there's God's sermon. For the first half of the sermon, my sermon, I study the text, I research the commentaries, I reflect on the articles, I craft and recraft every word. The problem with this half of the sermon, though, is what I call my sermon, is that while I write it, I'm always thinking, should I say this, and can I say that, and will this sentence confuse people? It's as if the devil's trying to tinker with my every thought. And so after I've done the best that I can with my sermon, I put the books away, I let the words flow, and I let the Spirit lead. When I do this, the devil himself has no idea what I'm going to say next, and so I call this God's sermon. The president of the congregation answered, Pastor, I noticed those two sermons long ago. I always wondered how they came to be. I could see it every week, your sermon and God's sermon. I just want you to know, though, I always liked your sermon the best. Let's be honest. Everyone prefers the preacher's sermon to God's sermon. You know, a long time ago, I read somewhere along the way that prayer is more about listening than it is speaking. I've always wondered why we fill our prayer lives with so many words. Then I realized it's easier to talk to God than it is to listen for God. Isn't that our reservation around using that word call as it relates to our lives? Sure, it's okay for clergy, we can be called. But if everyone can be called, that means we might have to start listening. And well, in today's world, who has time for that? Last week after worship, I was talking with Stuart Michels about the theme for this week's sermon. And he said, it must have been about 10 years ago or more now. I was on the Mexico mission trip with the youth from our church. It had been a really hard week. I was tired. I was ready to go home. In fact, I think it was the last day of our work. We were wrapping things up, so I was hurrying as fast as I could to get things loaded up on the truck so that we could head out. Of course, in Mexico, the sewer system doesn't work exactly like it does here in the States. Let's just say you're woefully aware when you're near a sewer vent. It just so happens that our truck is parked right next to one, and so I was straddling this sewer vent, trying to hold my breath in this god-awful heat, just doing anything I could to get out of there as quickly as possible. And it was Catherine Lockery who said, "Stuart, stop. Listen." I remember hearing her at first, but I was too busy to listen. She must have noticed because she said it again, "Stuart, stop. Listen." So I stopped and I listened. And I heard children laughing and playing, birds singing, young people hammering nails. At this point, Stuart had to stop and collect himself for a moment. And then he said, "I'll never forget what she said next." Catherine looked at me with a smile on her face and she said, "Stuart, doesn't it sound like heaven?" It does. If we take the time to listen. And you know what I mean. The child who plays piano, the newborn baby's cry, the attorney making an argument in a courtroom on behalf of the poor, the teacher teaching children to read, the young person who has the courage to come out to his family, the family who responds, "We love you no matter what," the mother singing a lullaby to her child, the friends standing up to the bully saying, "Stop." And yes, even young people on a mission trip in the sweltering heat, hammering nails. That woman who spoke at the Must Ministries fundraiser earlier this week, her story was hard to hear, but it did not end without hope. In fact, she told of how a group of people helped she and her children find housing again, how these same folks helped her family to buy groceries and to survive. They eventually helped to find her stability and employment again. And today she's living independently, raising 2 children on her own. She said to us, "I'd lost all hope. But through this ministry, God gave me hope again. I believe God saved me. Although I could have sworn I heard. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them. They know me." Turns out if you're not listening, you might just miss a glimpse of heaven. Or even more, resurrection altogether.